Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. In her widely popular TED Talk, researcher and professor Angela Duckworth shares why grit, more than talent, IQ, or luck, is a powerful indicator of success. In her late 20s, Angela left her job as a management consultant to teach math to seventh graders in the New York City public schools. It was that experience that sparked her curiosity about what really drives performance. Now a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, Angela has explored the correlation between grit and achievement in settings like West Point, the National Spelling Bee, and public school systems. Her book, Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance, is a New York Times bestseller, and Angela has advised the White House, the World Bank, NBA and NFL teams, and Fortune 500 CEOs. Today, we talk about how grit can be learned, how to discover what you are passionate about, and what makes gritty individuals different from others. This is one you don't want to miss because it's so applicable, whether you're a business leader, parent, coach, athlete, teacher, or student. Let's dig right in. Here's my conversation with Angela Duckworth. Angela Duckworth, what a treat to have you on. Thank you in your busy, gritty world. I appreciate you taking a minute.
I'm excited for this conversation.
So let's start with your own story. At 27, you quit a really comfortable job in consulting with McKinsey to teach middle school math full-time. Why the pivot?
You know, I was at McKinsey, as many people are there who, are thinking about what they're going to do actually in the long term that may not be McKinsey. And for me, I really knew that it would be something with kids, and I was figuring out what that would be. The next chapter was teaching, and I, figured if you're going to do anything that's going to help kids, it's going to be in some way related to their education. And if you're going to do something in education, you never want to be that person who's opining on something you don't really know about. So I wanted to be in the classroom.
And so in a lot of ways, you saw these ideas around talent and grit play out in the students that you taught, I've read. So how did your experience teaching spark your curiosity around grit?
I had a lot of frustration. Initially it was with the kids, like, hey, I made these beautiful lesson plans. Like, why aren't they working? Mm-hmm. But of course, as any decent teacher will eventually recognize that the frustration really is with yourself, because you're obviously not doing something that's as helpful as you think. And when I thought about it, I thought, like, well, when these students of mine, aren't learning, or they're doing their homework, or, they're not participating in class, I have to understand why.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about being a psychologist is that, you always want to understand, why people decide to give up, decide to keep going. And so that set me onto the next chapter, I think, which is to unpack motivation. I think the final common path to achieving anything is high quality, high quantity effort. But I don't think anybody does that just by getting lectured at. And so I wanted to understand why some people are able to do, so much, with their lives, and other people, less so. And that's what I'm still trying to work on today.
And so for our listeners who haven't read Grit, which if they haven't, they're missing out. It's an amazing read, of course. What's the big takeaway?
For me, the takeaway is that the common denominator of the high achievers that I've studied, Olympic athletes and Nobel laureates, CEOs, entrepreneurs, is that they figure out something that they care enough about to work on 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, for years, if not decades, if not eventually a lifetime, and to work incredibly hard at it, which means both being resilient in the face of setbacks, which are inevitable and frequent, and also when there aren't setbacks, when things are going pretty well, to have this kind of leaning forward, never getting complacent, always trying to improve, like literally waking up every day and asking, what is one thing that I can do better today?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that combination of passion and perseverance it is a hallmark of high achievers. It is not to say, and I think this is important to say what the book is not about. It's not to say that, there isn't such a thing as luck or that opportunities are equal for everyone, which, they're not. This is an unfair
Sure.
world. So I just want to say that, common denominator, yes, grit. The only thing, no, it's not the only thing that determines what's going to happen to you in life.
Got it. And you touched on the definition of grit, but can you define that for folks?
I define grit as the combination of perseverance and passion. I think the perseverance part's the obvious part, like, oh, grit, that sounds like hard work. That sounds like sticking with things.
Mm-hmm.
But most people that I talk to and study would say that the harder thing for them to have developed was an understanding of direction, not determination, but like, what am I going to apply all this hard work and resilience toward? And especially when I, work with younger adults or, adolescents who haven't quite, figured out what their calling is or, are struggling really even to figure out something they're interested in. I think that is more torturous than like, oh, but can you work hard? So it's not just perseverance, it's also passion.
So do you need both then? I mean, is that what I'm hearing? You need both?
For me, you need both. If you just had passion and you never worked at anything, I think, you would end up being like very frustrated because you wouldn't get very far. And then if you have perseverance without passion, right? That to me is this very grim picture of somebody who's working incredibly hard at something they don't even love.
Sure.
And so I hope for people that they would have both and not one or the other.
So what do you tell people that are maybe struggling to figure out their passion? I hear that. I'm sure you hear that a lot. You just touched on it. How do you advise people to try to uncover that passion or that purpose piece?
First I would be empathic. I mean, honestly, I took a decade, right? I mean, 10 long years trying to figure out what I was going to do with my opportunities and, eventually figured out as a psychologist. But, I did wonder, like, how the heck did it take me to 32, between 22 and 32, of course, between college and I couldn't believe how slow I had been. So first I would have empathy. I mean, I do think it's very hard. I think that I can give you a little bit of advice to make that cycle time a little shorter, but honestly, the discovery and the development of what you love is a process that is trial and error.
Mm-hmm.
The metaphor I think that's most accurate is like you are in this big buffet line called life, and the most important thing is to keep tasting things. You can't like think your way into what you're going to do
Mm-hmm.
for a living. You can't reason your way. You can't journal writing your way. You have to actually try things. So the number one error that I see people make is that they just sit there and they think about it. Like, I don't
Mm.
know, maybe I would like to be in the law. Like, I don't know, maybe civil rights. Like, okay, just do it, taste
Right.
it.
Sure.
It's like the durian fruit. You will not know what the durian fruit tastes like until you taste the durian fruit. And no amount of reasoning or writing in your journal will get you there.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. So grit feels clearly sort of like an intangible, a thing that's often pretty hard to measure, but you have found a way to measure it. How did you find a way to measure it? How did you do that?
The way that I typically measure grit in my research studies is that I ask people to respond to a bunch of statements. It's called the grit scale.
Mm-hmm.
And these statements came from, they're the distillation of interviews of, very gritty and successful people. And so you just reflect on, how hard a worker are you compared to most people? Do you finish what you begin? Do you tend to have interests that are consistent over long stretches of time? Or are you the sort of person who at this point in their lives is kind of flitting around from one project to another? So these are just statements really
Mm-hmm.
from interviews that you then can compare yourself to. The grit scale is by no means a thermometer in the sense that it's like objective and it's super precise. So it's kind of a noisy measure of what your grit is. But I think it's actually a good tool for science when you have lots of people and in my research studies, I tend to have like thousands of people. So it's a little noisy as a
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
measurement thing, but it's the word. The other thing I think it's really helpful is just as a tool for self-reflection. I think when you read these statements, it'll give you something to think about. And you might, say, I wonder why I couldn't, fully endorse this item. Like maybe there's something to work on.
And how have you measured the accuracy of the results of people's scores against the grit scale?
So, for example, I'll just describe one study at West Point, where I've been doing research on grit for more than a decade. We have the cadets take the grit scale, and this is at the very beginning of their training.
Hmm.
So, at the beginning of their 4 years. This is the oldest military academy in the United States,
Right,
and
sure.
it's very hard. It takes a lot of grit, frankly, to finish and to graduate. And I can say that because, to answer your question, we know your grit scores at the very beginning of this challenge, but we also know what happens. We have all your grades. We have whether you made it through the first difficult training, which they call Beast Barracks at West Point, and we know whether you graduated, and we can say definitively, because we've collected data now on more than 10,000 cadets, that yes, grit does predict all of the outcomes that I mentioned. We also know other things about you, and I just want to underscore that to focus on grit does not mean to say that other things don't matter. And so, for example, for your academic grades at West Point, your SAT score or your ACT score is super predictive. In fact, for your grades, more predictive than grit. So grit isn't everything. And grit isn't always the most important thing.
So I was dying to ask you this question. What's your grit score? I've of course taken it.
Well, if I'll tell you if you tell me, but I'll go first. I'm a 4.7 or a 4.8 depending on the day. So yeah, I'm pretty gritty. But I'm not a 5 out of 5. How about you?
Yeah. I was a 4.6.
Yeah, you sound
I was
pretty
a
gritty.
4.6.
What do you remember? Which items, or like, were you higher in perseverance or in passion, or?
I don't remember exactly, but I remember, to your point, the questions themselves made me reflect on the way I approached different opportunities, how quickly I got distracted from two different opportunities. So it was, I mean, I think it's really cool. And of course, with you benchmarking against places like West Point and others, it's powerful. It's really a cool assessment. I encourage people to go take it.
Well, not everyone wants to get grittier, by the way. Some
Sure.
people would say like, "Hey, I'm a 3.1. I'm pretty happy 3.1." And I think, that's a choice. I think that's a personal choice. I don't think there's anything unethical about, not having grit.
Is grit something that's transferable? So in other words, is it when we think about teams or sports or even business that maybe they're described as gritty, can a whole team be described, or is it sort of more of an individual thing?
I think there are gritty organizations, right? Because you can have a culture that honors, that celebrates, and that encourages grit. What would that culture look like? Well, it would look like what an individual is, but just at the macro level, right? So that group of people would be working toward one goal that they really all believed in, that was meaningful to them, that had purpose, and they would be a resilient organization. So bad things would happen, and they would rise to the occasion, and they would be an organization that had ritualized practice and always trying to get better. So
Hmm.
I do believe in gritty organizations. You also asked if grit is transferable, and I'm of the opinion that you know grit is, to me, an aspect of character, right? Your kindness, your honesty, your grit, your empathy. And I do think that the word character suggests that you can transfer these things across domains. It's not like you're just honest in this setting but not in the. So I think ideally you would have people who could see how they could apply their grit in different situations. The one complexity here is that I don't think you can be gritty about everything. To be gritty is to be really determined about something, but you can't, set out to be, the fastest runner in the world and also the best CEO in the world, but also like, discover the cure for cancer. I do think that part of grit is picking what you're going to work on. And so doing, closing a lot of opportunity, those doors that we, sometimes feel badly when we hear doors of opportunity shut. But I think that's part of grit too.
That's cool. So if you're a coach or maybe a leader in an organization, how do you advise people to try to hire for grit? What should they look for as signals that someone's gritty?
I, in particular, look for a track record of grit, and that is most clearly seen in my experience on the resume. Right? Tell me how you spent your time. What did you do over the last few years? And even young people who are 22, so they haven't had a job yet, but they have their extracurriculars, and that is inclusive of their work experiences. So where have you seen evidence that this person knows how to work hard, get feedback, lose a game, come back again, do something over years? So for example, if I look at somebody's resume and they just seem to be doing like all different things, for short periods, I would worry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a big fan of interviewing for grit. That may be because I don't know how to do it, but somebody else out there does. But I will tell you that thing about grit is, you can have a really bad day. In fact, you could be weeping at the end of the day. You could be even saying out loud, as I have at the end of bad days, both been weeping and saying out loud that I quit, because I've done exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the thing that makes me say that, that the interview or that is because, I will get up and I will be there the next day. And that's very hard to get out of an interview.
Sure. You'll show back up.
Right. Exactly.
What style negotiator are you? In other words, how do you show up? In our Game Changer negotiation training workshops, we teach the value of what we call 360-degree awareness. We all negotiate differently based on our upbringing, lifestyles, and business background. An awareness around our own negotiation style enhances our ability to succeed in any negotiation. To get started, we've created an assessment to help you identify which style negotiator you are. Take the assessment at GameChanger360.com and start your journey to becoming a Game Changer negotiator today. Now back to the show. So, we live in a world where performance, and I have a background in sports, so I saw it so much in sports, is such a big measure, people's performance. And grit is clearly necessary to perform. It is a component of it, you've said. But where does somebody's happiness fit in? Because often I have seen, sadly, happiness take a second, tier to sort of, winning, right? So they win, but they're not happy and they haven't taken care of themselves maybe along the way.
Well, I would love to hear you speak more about this than me, but first, just to say, well-being, as it's often called these days, or happiness, fulfillment, peace. I mean, there are maybe different varieties of well-being that we should hold as important. I think they're not the same thing as objective achievement, and they're also not the same thing as grit. And there's no guarantee necessarily that if you have one, you're going to have the other. And like you, I have observed people who are really, you read about it in the newspaper, people whose careers are just unbelievable, and they're at the peak, and you learn that they took their own lives, right? So these things can't be taken for granted as being the same thing. I would say that it's possible to be gritty and to be achieving objectively and happy. In our data, I find that grit and your personal subjective feeling that you're satisfied with your life is positively correlated, actually very strongly correlated, but doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions, and I'm sure there are. I guess the thing is that if there is some kind of through line that I could speculate as to what makes somebody happy even though they're working so hard, is that they first of all understand that what they're trying to accomplish, that they have high standards, and that they're sort of at peace with not being at peace in a way. They're kind of content being never content with their performance. So they've got this wisdom about them that understands that, like, yeah, I'm this kind of, I know of myself, I have ridiculously high standards. I never write a sentence that I'm, fully happy with, but I kind of get that about myself, and I'm like, okay with that. So I'm not really as tortured as you might think. I'm trying to not compare myself to other people, and mostly live my life comparing myself to, who I was yesterday. I think there's also a kind of peace that comes with that.
I believe it's anchored in our purpose. If we're being gritty with a clear purpose, then I think that we don't lose the happiness and hopefully the well-being piece.
Yes, purpose is and I think in our, society today, there are so many people really across all segments of society who are yearning for purpose. And I think it was Viktor Frankl, among others, who pointed out that, without a purpose, you can't do anything. And with a purpose, you can do almost anything.
So you talk about how we grow grit from the inside out. So how would you tell somebody to do that?
I think that when I think about grit, I think, both the aspects that are DIY, like, oh, this is how grit works. Like, let me try, figuring out how I can do this better myself. And then also importantly from the outside in, which is to say, like, where do you need other people? Where do you need to be in an organization or community, or in a relationship that supports you? But from the DIY perspective, my sort of big, idea here, or my bet, is that if you understand, I mean, this is why I think, you must in some way feel like this is true of your podcast. Like, if people could understand, if they really had in a way a user manual for excellence, or for grit in this case, then they would at least be a couple steps ahead, right? So I guess I feel like with DIY grit, if you understand that what gritty people have is not just one thing, but two things: passion and perseverance. Okay, you're a half step ahead. Now, if you understand that passion comes from not only being interested in something, but feeling like it has purpose. Okay, now you're another half step ahead.
Sure.
Now, if you understand the science of purpose, like, what is purpose? Like, what has science discovered? So I think these are the DIY insights. You basically try to reverse engineer what really gritty people are like, and put that together with scientific research. And you're like, oh, this is a great user's manual. Let me try to do it myself. But I really do believe it's not just DIY. So you do need a ton of support. This is the way human beings as animals have like evolved. We just tend to need a lot of cultivation and support. We're not like horses who can, like, you get born and you run, you're a horse.
Yeah. What role would you say does adversity play in development of grit?
Just last night I had dinner with just one of my favorite students, and he's a sophomore. His name is Eli, and he had a very, very tough life, lots of adversity. He ended up going to the Hershey School, which was founded by Milton Hershey of candy bar fame, and it's for orphans, actually, for kids who, orphans now broadly defined, but kids who really are not able to live in a stable family home. So they move to Hershey, Pennsylvania, and they spend their life until they're 18 there. And he's incredibly resilient and gritty. Eli is, now a Wharton student and doing phenomenally well. And we talked about adversity. And, I asked him, I said, I think a lot of people misunderstand grit because they think like, oh, if you're lecturing me about grit, it must mean that you don't appreciate that, there are adversity, trauma, there are things in my life that are difficult. And he said, I can see that perspective, but also, I feel like I have, it's not that I would wish upon anyone what I had to go through, but I do feel like my experiences have made me the person I am today. And that in overcoming certain adversities, I learned things that I'm now applying. So he gave me the example that he essentially got like sick this semester. He got viral meningitis, and he had to, miss 3 weeks of class. And when you're a Wharton student, I mean, it's a lot to miss, and like, make it up and like figure out how to get back on track and talk to each professor and figure out a plan. And a lot of his earlier adversity where he had to develop these skills are now serving him. And I have to say, I am inspired by stories like that. Again, not to say that I would wish adversity on anyone, not to say that I want to belittle, differences in income. There's people of different groups, if you're a woman, if you feel like, you've been, not treated fairly for other reasons. But I do believe that what Nietzsche said about adversity is true, which is, what doesn't kill you can make you stronger. It can, doesn't always.
Sure.
I feel like there's some wisdom there.
Yeah, I know as an athlete, for me personally, the losses and the failures in life taught me so much more sometimes than the wins.
So true. If you
different kind of adversity than Eli dealt with.
How was your mindset about that? Like, can you just tell me, because I'm sure you've seen lots of athletes who don't, squeeze the lemon of its lemon juice. Like it's just sour. Like what was the difference for you?
Candidly, I think I had a fair amount of passion and perseverance around the game of tennis, which it was for me. So I wanted to get back up the next day and go prove that I could compete and contribute to the team. So, I do think that the recovery piece from adversity is obviously imperative. And I think probably that recovery is anchored a bit in purpose and passion and certainly in perseverance. And so I think when you recover from those tough moments and you see success from that, you go, wow, that worked. I'm going to do that again and again. And so I think we have a low tolerance for failure in the world that we live in today, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And to me, failure is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and you see it going down. You see our tolerance for failure
Sure,
getting
I do.
getting weaker.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. Well, anyway, I think you're very insightful. I'm sure you have much more to teach me about that, but I would just agree with you that, if you can get yourself or somebody you care about that you're trying to, make a little grittier, if you can get them into just these little tiny positive feedback loops, right? Like try, I'm like, oh my gosh, it worked.
Right.
Right. And then, it's like compound interest. I do think there's a lot of truth there.
So, you have a lot of fans in sports and in the sports world. Seattle Seahawks coach Pete Carroll, of course, Boston Celtics coach Brad Stevens. In your research, how have you seen grit show up in the sports world and with athletes and with coaches? What have you learned from those guys?
In a way, I had never, well, I had, let me put it in the very past tense. Like I never really understood like sports and just like why, everyone's so excited about them. I'm not even the athletes, but like all the fans. And I'm like, what? Why? This is because I'm not an athlete and didn't grow up in a, family that was, watching or appreciating sports. But now as a psychologist, I think I can appreciate it much better. It's like, on the field or, in the arena, it's almost like a microcosm of life. It's just concentrated with the victories, the defeats, the pain, the drama. I can understand it, its appeal. And I would say from these coaches that they are world-class psychologists. I mean, there is no great coach who is not a world-class
Mm,
psychologist. And in fact, they're, much more admirable than, people like me who just sit around and read and write papers, because they have to do something much more complex, which is to apply all of that psychological wisdom in the world with people and all of their complexity. So I think these coaches have in so many ways figured out how to cultivate character and grit and to create positive cultures where people can be at their best. Of course, not all coaches are equally good at that.
hmm
But I do think if you want to look, in the world for examples of world-class cultivation of grit and character, sports is the, maybe the first place, certainly one of the first places I would be looking.
hmm How have you advised, if you will, coaches like Pete and Brad to grow grit in their players? And so maybe it's transferable to a business leader, how a business leader might, if they wanted to or they felt it was necessary, grow grit in their team.
Yeah, well, first I will take zero credit for anything that these like great teams do because our relationship is pretty informal and almost like thought partnership. Like oh what do you think about this? Like I had this idea, but I will say just taking from their example, I think many coaches and not just the ones you mentioned, but there are lots of other coaches who are also great and Olympic coaches and so forth. And my observation is that they are you know extremely supportive and challenging at the same time, which to me is the combination that like every great parent, every great leader who's a CEO, every great coach has. There's something about this kind of like, well, frankly, I'll use the L word, the love. I mean, they that they love you in this kind of unconditional way, but they're your toughest critic also. And I think that this combination is very hard to pull off. I'm trying to pull it off as a parent of two teenagers, and it's just very hard to execute. You're like, how do I communicate to you both that you are unconditionally loved and also that what you did yesterday was not good enough, right?
Right.
Like that, that it's unacceptable to like, whatever, leave your dishes on the table when other people live here, or you absolutely have to write that thank you note. I think it's very hard, but first and foremost, these coaches who are amazing are pulling it off really well. The other thing I'll just observe, which is maybe less obvious, the coaches that I admire the most, oh my gosh, they are seriously never done learning. I mean, you might not think of coaches as being like intellectuals, but they are paragons of curiosity. And so what's so appealing to me is that they're not just executing things that like they figured out 10 years ago. Like literally every day they're like, how does this work? Like, what's the neuroscience of that? Like, how could I figure this out, in a more clever way? So these coaches are world-class psychologists and they're really world-class intellectuals as well.
And so with their love and with the clarity and the expectations that they create, how does accountability play a role in their ability to get grit out of the guys that they coach?
I think they're keeping their players accountable, but not in the kind of like, well, you better start performing, or you need to come to this extra practice, or else.
Uh-huh.
Pete Carroll used to say, because I'd have these debates with them, like, the research says that when you practice at the limit of what you can do, typically people say it's like really effortful. It can be frustrating. It can be exhausting. How do you get your players to do it? How do you force them into more practice? And he said, you've got it wrong. He's like, you draw them in, and he draws them in with like music. He makes it fun. He has like surprises, like one time he had Will Ferrell come, like the comedian, and like dress up and like, and so I think that's why I respect these coaches so much. Not only do they get the basics right, but they figure out in the application of this, if you're going to be a great coach and frankly a great player, you have to figure out how to make it work for you. And that's even harder. So I think that's the sort of thing, not keeping people accountable because they're afraid of you or like you're going to demerit, but like I am drawn into this endeavor and in many cases I see its greater purpose.
So you said you're a mom of 2 teenage daughters. My husband and I have 3 teenage daughters. So
God bless you.
I'm with you on this train, girl. So I love the hard thing rule that you talk about in your house that you've said publicly. Can you share a little bit about that for our listeners?
Yeah, the hard thing rule has 3 parts. It says, first of all, that the person in this family, I mean, really everybody in this family has to do a hard thing. And that includes mom and dad. So for me, it was, my work is very hard. And then, my kids had to pick things even when they were little. And a hard thing was defined as something that requires daily practice to get better. The second thing is that you can't quit in the middle. So I was writing Grit, the book, and I, said out loud that I quit many times because I was so frustrated, but I never really did quit. And I did finish what I started.
Sure.
And when my 5-year-old daughter, Lucy, was, at, some activity, I guess usually probably in, at one point she cycled through a lot of hard things, like piano or something, you couldn't quit in the middle, meaning like you couldn't quit in the middle of the season or the session or, whatever your commitment had been. And the third part of the hard thing rule, the last part, is that nobody can pick your hard thing but you. And I think this is so important because in contrast to the tiger parenting philosophy, the tiger mom, like, well, you're going to practice piano whether you like it or not. I think people are always at their best when they have autonomy and choice. And that goes for 5-year-olds and 55-year-olds, right? So children, as early as they can, I'm not saying they don't need rules or boundaries or they should be able to cross the street when they want. I'm not saying that. I am saying that if you want your kid to grow up to be gritty, then you need to give them as much autonomy as possible in choosing what they're going to actually apply that grit toward. And yeah, they can quit after they've made their commitment, and then they can make another choice. Like, Lucy, my younger daughter, she cycled through a half dozen things before she started to gravitate to what she now is incredibly gritty about, which is, viola, which I would not have picked because I don't like music and I don't want to listen to her practice, on a Friday night. But, that was her path. And I think it's important that she chose it.
For sure. What's the biggest mistake you think people's parents make? What's the biggest mistake you see parents make when it comes to cultivating grit with their kids?
I think that they miss this, the importance of passion, and they kind of want to fast forward right to work ethic. And they I think, forget that, if kids don't have that autonomy and choice, then, odds are, and I know there are exceptions, but I think odds are against you that you're going to have a really, gritty kid about that. They're going to more likely end up being just resentful and burned out. I think that's the number one mistake. So I try as loudly as I can, shouting from the mountaintops, like grit is not about forcing your kids to do things that they don't enjoy.
Okay, can you share more about your work at the Character Lab and your vision there? I absolutely have so much admiration for that work. It's just absolutely awesome.
I have a nonprofit. It's called Character Lab, and we are trying to advance the science and the practice of character development, very broadly defined as, everything a child would need to live a good life for themselves and for others. So it's grit, but it's also empathy, and it's also social intelligence, and it's also curiosity. Actually, the list goes on. And one thing that, I'm really excited about is that I get to write a little note every week. I call it my thought of the week, and I send it out. Of course, it's free because we're a nonprofit, and it's one scientific insight about one aspect of character development, but made actionable. So it's designed really for parents and teachers to be able to read on a Sunday morning. It should take 60 seconds or fewer to read. And that's the sort of thing that Character Lab is up to.
So cool. And how do people access that?
Yeah, you can sign up at characterlab.org. And you can also find all of our playbooks. And every word on that site is written by or endorsed by a scientist. So it's really kind of like direct to the scientist.
Wow.
It's not, you don't have to worry like, but is it really true? I mean, this is the most, I think, scientifically credible advice there is for parents and teachers on the internet.
All right, rapid fire real quick, Angela. We'll go. What book would you recommend for leaders?
I think Mindset by Carol Dweck is the book I would say is most commonly on the bookshelf of the CEOs that I talk to.
Book you would recommend for parents?
Book for parents. I'm going to give you one that's not by a scientist, but Blessings of a Skinned Knee, which I read when I was a parent. And it is about how, Wendy Mogul, about how, especially in today's world, kids need to know how to skin their knee and make their own, piece of toast and like other things that will, it's basically a book against kind of like over coddling kids.
What's an organization or a team you'd love to study?
I have to say, I am good friends with Jackie Bezos, who is the mother of Jeff Bezos. I have a lot of admiration actually for the Amazon team. So I would love to study Amazon. I'd love to study the leadership style of somebody like a Jeff Bezos.
So one last question. The show is called Game Changers. Who's a game changer that inspires you and why?
I think if you ask me, who's my role model, like who do I want to grow up to be, if I could say that at age 49, Carol Dweck. And I mentioned Mindset before, but this is somebody who, had an idea when she was still in graduate school. Why do people give up on things and other people persist? That led to the idea of growth mindset, the belief that abilities can change. And really, actually, that idea has changed the world. And so if I did anything that was a fourth of that, I would die a happy woman.
Angela, thank you so much for your time. This is so insightful.
Oh, I loved this conversation. I thought it was great, and I hope there's another one in our future.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.